Everyone wants to warn you about getting older, as if it's something that sneaks up on you in the night and steals things from your house while you're asleep. Your strength, your memory, your independence. As if aging is a thief and you are its victim. I don't believe that. I have lived long enough to know that aging is not something that happens to you, nearly as much as it is something you participate in, quietly, day by day, in ways so small you don't notice them until the result is already sitting in your bones. And by then, most people think it's too late to change anything. That's the part I disagree with. I am not going to give you 10 habits or 5 tricks or a morning routine that promises to turn you into someone you were 30 years ago. That version of you is gone, and chasing it will only make you tired. What I am going to talk about are 3 mistakes, not dramatic mistakes, not the kind that ruin your life overnight. The kind that feel harmless, reasonable even. The kind that settle in slowly and begin to shape how you think, how you move, how you show up in the world until one day you realize something inside you has gone quiet. I have seen it happen more times than I can count. Friends, neighbors, people I sat beside for years who did everything they were supposed to do. They ate carefully, they followed instructions, they stayed safe. And still, something in them aged faster than it should have. Not their bodies, not at first. Something else, something harder to name and easier to ignore until it is almost gone. There is a look people get. You may have seen it. It is not sadness exactly, not even fatigue. It is a kind of dimming, like a room where the lights are still on, but someone has turned the brightness down just enough that you hesitate before stepping inside. I started noticing that look in people when I was in my late 60s. At the time, I thought it was simply what happened. You reach a certain age and the light fades. That is what I told myself because it was easier than asking why. But the older I got, the more I paid attention, and the more I realized something uncomfortable. The people who lost that light were not all the same. They did not share the same health, the same history, or the same luck. What they shared were patterns, small decisions repeated over time that slowly narrowed their world until there was less and less of them left inside it. And the opposite was also true. There were people, not many but enough to notice, who seemed to move through their 70s and 80s with something intact. Not youth. I am not talking about pretending to be young. I am talking about presence, a kind of aliveness that made you feel it when they entered a room. They were not louder, not healthier necessarily, but they had not disappeared from themselves. I want you to understand this clearly before we go any further. The difference between those 2 kinds of people is not luck. It is not genetics, and it is not something reserved for a special few. It comes down to choices, quiet ones, repeated ones, the kind you make without announcing them, without even realizing you are making them. The trouble is, no one warns you about these choices. Or if they do, they dress them up in language so simple, it sounds like advice you can ignore. Things like stay engaged, or keep a positive attitude. That kind of advice slides right off a person because it doesn't touch anything real. It doesn't show you where exactly the shift happens. So I am going to show you where it happens. Not in theory, not in something I read. In moments, specific ones. Because that is where your life actually lives. Not in big ideas, but in ordinary afternoons and quiet decisions that seem too small to matter. The first mistake begins so subtly that most people never notice when they cross into it. It doesn't feel like giving something up. It feels like being considerate, thoughtful, easy to be around. And for a long time, it even looks like a strength. People appreciate you for it. They describe you in ways that sound like compliments. Kind, flexible, no trouble at all. I was very good at this, better than most. There is a particular afternoon I remember, though I didn't think much of it at the time. I must have been around 72. My son had come over with his family, and we were deciding what to do for dinner. Nothing important, just one of those small family negotiations that happen without consequence, or so it seems. Someone suggested a place I didn't like. Too loud, food I found heavy. I remember opening my mouth to say something, and then closing it again almost immediately. It was easier to agree, easier to go along. There were more of them than me after all. And it wasn't worth making it into a discussion. So I smiled and said, "That sounds fine." And it was fine. We went, we ate, everyone else enjoyed it. I sat there, nodded at the right moments, and told myself this is what it means to be easy, to be gracious, to not make things about yourself. If that had been the only time, it would not matter. But it wasn't. It was one of hundreds. Thousands, if I'm honest. Small moments where I stepped back, adjusted, softened my preferences until they became almost invisible, even to me. And here is the part no one tells you. You don't feel the loss immediately. There is no alarm, no sharp pain, just a gradual shift, like furniture being moved in a room while you are not looking. Until one day, you try to sit where you always have and realize the chair is no longer there. That is where the first mistake begins. Not in something dramatic, but in something that feels harmless enough to repeat. And most people do repeat it, for years, until they don't quite recognize themselves anymore. The first mistake has a way of disguising itself as kindness for so long that by the time you recognize it, it already feels like part of your personality. No one wakes up one morning and decides to disappear from their own life. It happens gradually, through moments so ordinary they barely register. After that dinner I told you about, there were many others. Different restaurants, different conversations, different small decisions where I chose what was easiest instead of what was true. I told myself I was keeping the peace. I told myself it didn't matter, and each time that was technically correct. It didn't matter in isolation. But lives are not lived in isolation. They are lived in patterns. I remember a Sunday afternoon not long after, sitting in my living room with the television on. A program I did not care for, but one my son enjoyed. He had left it playing before stepping outside to take a call. I sat there, watching something that did not interest me, in my own house, and I did not reach for the remote. That is such a small thing, isn't it? Almost too small to mention. And yet I have learned to pay attention to moments like that, because they reveal something deeper. I wasn't avoiding conflict. There was no conflict. I wasn't being polite. No one was there. What I was doing was following a habit so ingrained that it no longer required a reason. I had trained myself to override my own preferences automatically. That is what shrinking looks like in its later stages. It no longer feels like a choice. It feels like who you are. And the cost of that is not just emotional, though people often describe it that way. The cost shows up in your body, in the way you sit, the way you speak, the way your eyes settle on things without quite engaging. There is less energy because there's less of you being expressed. I started noticing the contrast more clearly when I spent time with a woman named Eleanor. She lived 2 houses down from me, and she was in her late 70s when we first became acquainted. Eleanor was not loud or forceful. If anything, she spoke more softly than I did. But she had a clarity about her that was unmistakable. If you asked Eleanor what she wanted, she told you, not with explanation, not with apology, just with a kind of quiet certainty that made the conversation simpler for everyone involved. One afternoon, a group of us were deciding on plans for a small gathering. The usual back and forth began. Suggestions, hesitations, polite deferrals. When it was Eleanor's turn, she said, "I'd prefer to stay in. I don't have the energy for a restaurant tonight." There was a brief pause, the kind that usually invites negotiation, but she did not fill it. She did not soften her statement or offer alternatives to make it more acceptable. She simply let it stand. And something interesting happened. No one was offended. No one pushed back. The conversation adjusted around her clarity, not against it. That moment stayed with me because it revealed something I had misunderstood for years. I had believed that making myself smaller made things easier for other people, that it smoothed interactions, reduced friction, kept relationships intact. But watching Eleanor, I realized the opposite can be true. Clarity is easier to respond to than constant accommodation. When you remove yourself from the equation, other people are left guessing. When you show up fully, even quietly, the entire interaction becomes more grounded. It took me time to test this for myself. Habits that have been built over decades do not disappear because you notice them. They resist. They whisper that changing now is unnecessary, that it is too late, that this is simply how things are. The first time I pushed against that habit, it felt disproportionate to the situation. My daughter had asked where I wanted to go for lunch. A simple question, one I had answered reflexively for years, with some version of whatever you like. This time, I paused. And in that pause, I could feel the old response waiting, ready, practiced, comfortable. It would have been easy to let it come out. Instead, I said, I'd like to go somewhere quiet. My voice sounded different to me. Not louder, not sharper, just more direct. No tension. She nodded and said, all right, as if this were the most natural answer in the world. And in a way, it was. I was the one who had made it complicated all those years. That is how the reversal begins, not with a grand declaration, but with small interruptions of an old pattern, moments where you choose not to disappear. And something returns when you do that. It is difficult to describe precisely, but you feel it almost immediately. A kind of internal alignment, as if parts of you that had been slightly out of place begin to settle back where they belong. Over time, those moments accumulate, just as the shrinking did. But the direction is different. Instead of narrowing your world, they expand it. Instead of reducing your presence, they restore it. The mistake is not in being kind. It is not in being flexible or generous. Those things matter. They always have. The mistake is in erasing yourself in the process, in believing that your preferences are obstacles rather than part of the structure of your life. Because when you remove that structure, everything else becomes weaker. Your relationships, your sense of self, even your experience of time. Days begin to blur when you are not fully inside them. Decisions feel distant. Conversations pass through you instead of landing. And that's how aging accelerates in a way no one talks about. Not through years, but through absence. Through the gradual reduction of your own participation in your life. That's the first mistake. And if you recognize even a small part of yourself in it, then you also have the ability to begin stepping out of it. Not all at once. The second mistake is quieter, and in some ways more understandable, which is precisely why so many people slip into it without resistance. If the first mistake is about slowly removing yourself from your present life, the second is about relocating yourself somewhere else entirely. The past is a comfortable place. It is organized. It is known. Even the painful parts of it have edges you understand. There is a beginning, a middle, and an end. You can revisit it, adjust it, tell it in ways that make sense to you now. There is a kind of control in that, a kind of stability that the present does not always offer. And when you reach a certain age, the past becomes very full of people, of routines, of roles you inhabited for so long that they still feel like home. A house you built room by room, year after year, until you could walk through it in the dark without touching a wall. I did not realize how much time I had started spending there until after my husband died. His name was Daniel. We were married for 53 years. 53 years is long enough that a person's presence becomes part of the structure of your days. Not just the big things, but the small ones. The way mornings begin, the way evenings settle, the quiet assumptions that shape how you move through time. When he was gone, it was not just that I missed him. It was that the present no longer felt properly arranged. Things were still where they had always been, but they no longer connected in the same way. The rhythm was off. At first, I did what most people do. I held on to memory. I revisited it constantly. The sound of his voice, the way he would pause before answering a question, the particular way he folded the newspaper, even when no one else would see it. Those memories were not the problem. They were in many ways a comfort, a continuation of something that had mattered deeply. The shift happened when I began to prefer them. There is a difference between carrying the past with you and choosing to live inside it. I began to compare everything. Every conversation, every meal, every quiet moment was measured against what had been, and almost everything came up short. Not because the present was lacking, but because I was holding it against something complete, something finished, something that had already revealed its full meaning. The present cannot compete with that. It is unfinished by nature, uneven, sometimes dull, sometimes surprising, in ways you cannot predict. But if you stop allowing it to unfold, if you decide quietly, without announcing it, that the most meaningful parts of your life are behind you, then something in you stops reaching forward. I saw this happen to a man I knew named Arthur. He had been a teacher, the kind students remembered years later, thoughtful, patient, deeply engaged in his work. When he retired, people spoke about him with admiration. He had done something that mattered. For a while, he adjusted well. He traveled a bit, spent time with his family, took up small projects. But gradually, his conversations shifted. They became anchored almost entirely in what he had done, who he had been, how things used to be. At first, it sounded like reflection, the natural looking back that comes with time. But over the years, it became something else, a kind of repetition, the same stories, the same comparisons, the same conclusions about how the world had changed, and not for the better. What was missing was curiosity. He stopped asking questions about what was happening now, stopped engaging with anything that did not fit into the framework of his past experience. It was as if he had decided that the important part of his life was complete, and everything after that was simply an extension. And you could see it in him, not in any dramatic way, but in small details, the way he listened without really hearing, the way his responses came quickly, already formed, as if he were not processing something new, but retrieving something old. He was still there. But something in him had settled too firmly into what had already been. I recognized pieces of that in myself, and it unsettled me more than I expected. The turning point did not come from a realization or a conversation. It came from something smaller, almost insignificant if you were looking at it from the outside. I was sitting by the window one afternoon, watching the street the way I often did. People passing, cars moving, nothing unusual. And there was a moment, brief but clear, where I noticed I was not really seeing any of it. I was somewhere else entirely, replaying something that had happened years before. And I had a simple, almost uncomfortable thought. If I continue like this, I will miss what is still happening. Not in a dramatic sense. There was no urgency to it. Just a quiet recognition that life was still moving, and I was not fully inside it. That is the second mistake. Not remembering, not honoring what has been, but allowing it to become more real to you than what is in front of you now. Because when that happens, your days begin to flatten. Not because there is nothing in them, but because you are not meeting them where they are. The correction is not to abandon the past. That would be impossible, and it would also be wrong. The past is part of you, it informs everything, but it is not where you live. Living requires participation. It requires a willingness to let today be incomplete, to let it surprise you, to let it be enough even when it does not measure up to what you remember. That can feel like a loss at first, a lowering of expectations, but it is not. It is an adjustment of attention. When you return your attention to the present, even in small ways, something begins to shift. Colors feel a little sharper. Conversations carry a little more weight. Time, which had started to blur, becomes more distinct again. Not because anything external has changed, but because you are back inside your own life. And that, more than anything, slows the kind of aging that has nothing to do with years. The third mistake is the one people defend the most, and for good reason. It doesn't look like a mistake. It looks like strength. It looks like independence, like capability, like a life that has been managed well enough that you do not have to rely on anyone else more than necessary. For most of your life, that belief probably served you. It helped you build things, hold things together, get through moments that would have broken you if you had not learned how to stand on your own. So when I tell you that this same instinct can begin to age you faster than almost anything else, I want you to hear it in the right way. Not as a criticism of what you have done, but as a warning about what happens when you never put it down. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from refusing to need anyone. It is not the obvious kind, not the kind where you sit in an empty room and feel the absence of people around you. Many people can tolerate that, even enjoy it. Solitude, when it is chosen, can be peaceful. This is something else. This is the loneliness of being surrounded by people and still remaining untouched by them, of having conversations that never quite reach you, of maintaining a version of yourself that is always composed, always capable, always just slightly out of reach. I lived like that longer than I care to admit. After my husband was gone, I became very efficient at managing my own life. Bills, appointments, repairs, routines. I took a certain pride in it. There was satisfaction in knowing that I could handle what needed to be handled without asking for help. At first it felt like dignity, and then, slowly, it became distance. I remember a winter morning when the ground outside had frozen overnight, and everything was covered in that thin, glassy layer that makes even familiar paths uncertain. I needed to go to the store. Nothing urgent, just ordinary errands. I stood at the door longer than necessary, looking at the steps, calculating the risk. And for a moment I considered calling someone, my daughter, a neighbor, anyone who might have been available. The thought came and went quickly. "I'll manage," I said out loud, as if there were someone there to hear it. And I did manage, carefully, slowly, with more effort than I would have admitted to anyone else. I came back tired in a way that had nothing to do with the distance or the cold. It would have been easy to frame that as a small victory, proof that I was still capable, still independent. But something about it stayed with me, and not in a satisfying way. Because the truth was, I had not chosen independence in that moment. I had avoided vulnerability. There is a difference. Independence is the ability to stand on your own when you need to. Avoidance is the refusal to lean, even when leaning would make your life fuller, easier, more connected. And over time, that refusal creates a kind of separation that is difficult to undo. People stop offering because you always decline. Conversations stay on the surface because you never bring anything deeper into them. Relationships become polite, contained, carefully balanced, so that nothing is ever required of you. It feels safe. It is also isolating in a way that builds slowly enough that you do not notice it until it has already settled into your days. The moment that shifted this for me did not feel important at the time. It was not dramatic. It did not arrive with any sense of revelation. I had misplaced something in the house. A small thing, but one I needed. I looked for it in all the usual places, growing more frustrated as time passed. Eventually, I sat down and realized I had two options: keep searching or ask for help. Even then, I hesitated. It felt unnecessary, excessive, something I should be able to solve on my own. But instead of following that instinct, I picked up the phone and called a neighbor. When she arrived, we looked together. It took less than 10 minutes to find what I had been searching for. That was not the part that mattered. What mattered was everything around it, the conversation that followed, the way the room felt less closed, less contained, the simple shift from being alone with a problem to sharing a moment with another person. It was such a small change, almost trivial, and yet it stayed with me far more than all the times I had managed things on my own, because it reminded me of something I had quietly forgotten. Connection is not a reward for strength. It is a requirement for being fully alive. When you remove that from your life, when you decide intentionally or not that you will handle everything yourself, you are not preserving your dignity. You are limiting your experience. You are narrowing the ways in which life can reach you. And just like the other mistakes, this one compounds. Days become more predictable. Interactions become fewer. Your world, which once expanded naturally through other people, begins to contract around what you can manage alone. That contraction feels like control at first. But over time, it becomes something else. It becomes a kind of quiet fading. The reversal again is not dramatic. It does not require you to become dependent or to abandon the strength you have built over a lifetime. It requires something much smaller and much harder. It requires you to allow space for other people, to ask occasionally, to accept even when it feels unnecessary, to let someone sit with you in a moment that you could, technically, handle on your own. They are about connection. And connection is what keeps you present, engaged, and in a very real sense, alive in ways that go beyond the physical. So there they are, 3 mistakes. Shrinking yourself until you are barely present in your own life. living in the past until the present feels like an afterthought, refusing to need anyone until your world becomes smaller than it has to be. None of them happen all at once. None of them announce themselves. But all of them, if repeated long enough, will take something from you that is very difficult to get back. The good news, if there is any, is that the opposite is also true. Small moments of presence, small acts of honesty, small openings toward other people. They build, they restore, they bring something back that you may not have realized was fading. You do not need to change everything. You do not need to become someone new. You only need to notice where you have stepped away from your own life and take one step back toward it. That is enough.